Happy Palm Sunday, everyone. Thanks for joining me as we begin this Holy Week and we continue with our series When Everything Went Wrong. No, When Everything Went Right. And today's message is called When Failure Claims Us, and our passage of Scripture comes from Luke 22:54 through 62. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. And Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. And about an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." And Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you are talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter, and then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. God bless the reading of the word of God for the people of God. An unexpected response. Jason was the only child of a cantaloupe farmer, James Dancer Williams. At 15 years of age, he had a brushy head of dark hair, permanent grin plastered on his face, and muscles that would normally be found only on a child 4 to 5 years older than he was. It was just him and his dad working to keep the farm going during times that were mostly hard here in the heat of Parable, Texas. His mother had passed away from pneumonia when he was 8, but he was still remembered her sparkling smile and loving arms. Life had just not been the same since she was gone. Every year, he and his dad struggled to bring in enough crops to make it through the year. Now, Jason attended classes at Jesse L. Porter High School in Parable, and his days consisted of morning chores before school, then classes followed by after-school chores and nights studying, except on those nights when he and his dad had to set up with sick animal or had a calf that had to be delivered or something like that. Saturdays were relegated to farm work with rest on Sunday after church, and unless it was harvest time, of course, when all of his attention was given to bringing in the cantaloupe crops. Now, James Dancer Williams, Dancer because he'd been known to cut a fine rug in his younger days, took his responsibilities seriously. He had lost most of the joy in his life when his wife passed, but remained loyal to raising his son. Helen would have wanted it that way. At times he felt he was too stern with the boy, but it took both of them working hard to keep the farm afloat. There was just not enough time for them to have any other time for themselves. And he kept God in his heart, and he did his best to help his son remember the importance of their faith. So he insisted that Sundays were set aside for church and rest. Yeah. This year had been a good one, with surplus crops. And Dancer didn't want the extra cantaloupe to go to waste, so he decided to give the farmers market a whirl and see if they could make a little extra cash. That shouldn't be too difficult. The market was only open on the 2nd and 4th Saturdays of each month, and he had already missed the deadline for turning in his fees for the 2nd Saturday, but managed to scrape up enough cash to secure a spot on the 4th Saturday. And they would load up the truck on Friday night so that they could be at the market early the next morning. But on Thursday, the tractor had sputtered and died, and he knew he had no choice but to make time to fix it. So He was having to go to town on Friday to Sam's junkyard and see if he could salvage a fuel pump from one of the many dead tractors on the lot. He knew it might take him all day to find the right one, even if Sam was available to help him look. School was out for teacher training, so Jason would be at home. Looking up from his eggs and toast at breakfast, he spoke to his son. "Jason, I have to run into town and try to scrounge up a fuel pump for the tractor. I know that I told you that we would load the truck together, but this is something that has to be done, and I need you to take care of getting the truck loaded while I'm gone." "When will you be back?" Jason asked. "Well, it may take me all day, Jason. It depends on how quickly I can find a pump in decent enough condition and will fit our tractor. I will get back as soon as I can." "Gee, Dad, since there wasn't any school and I'm caught up on my chores, I was going to hang out with some of the guys at school." "Son, you know this is far more important. If you get the truck loaded early, then you'll have plenty of time to go meet up with your friends." "Well, gee, okay, Dad. You can count on me. I will get it done." "I appreciate it, son. I will see you when I get back." "All right, Dad. Well, good luck on your search." With that, Dancer left the house, put his tools into the car, and headed for Sam's. Maybe he would get lucky and find the pump quickly. Well, right after his dad left, the phone rang. It was Jason's friend Bruce from school. "Jason, the TMP train is coming through the junction at 10 this morning, and guess what? It's loaded with all kinds of military equipment. You know, tanks, trucks, a helicopter, and even a couple of missiles from what I hear. You got to come see. Jeff and Myron are going to meet us at the old depot." "I can't, Bruce. I promised my dad I would load the truck for the farmer's market tomorrow. I'm going to have to pass this time." "But Jason, there may not be a next time. This is going to be epic." "Oh, I wish I could, Bruce, but there's just no way." "Look, Jason, if you will come join us, then Myron, Jeff, and I will come home with you afterwards and help you load the truck." "Well, that sounds like it might work. Yeah, sure, I'll see you at the depot as soon as I can get there." "Great, Jason. I'm glad you see it my way. Man, this is going to be something else." With that, Jason hung up the phone, grabbed his jacket, hopped on his bike, and headed for the depot where he met up with his friends. Although they were excited and filled with anticipation, the train was over 2 hours late. When it finally reached Parable, there were over 60 cars in the train filled with all kinds of military equipment. Because the train crossed several major intersections, it had slowed to a crawl when it came through Parable. There was even a point where the train had to come to a dead stop so tracks could be switched, and since it had already stopped, the engineers decided it'd be a good time to inspect the couplings and freight tie-downs. And by the time the train had moved on past the depot, it had been over 5 hours. Now, this had been the most exciting day for the boys as they watched the train until it was out of sight. They decided to grab a hamburger over at the local diner and regale themselves with everything they had witnessed. And finishing up his burger, Jason looked out the window only to realize that it was getting dark. "Guys, we have to get that truck loaded for my dad. It's getting late." "What are you talking about?" said Myra and Jeff together. "Bruce promised me that if I joined you today, all of you would help me get the truck loaded with cantaloupe for the farmer's market tomorrow." "Gee, Jason, it's late. I've got to get home," said Jeff. "My mom will kill me if I don't get my chores done," said Myron. Bruce sheepishly spoke up. I promised you we would help you, Jason, but it's just way too late. We can't help tonight." "But guys, you promised, and I really need the help." "We'll just have to help you some other time, Jason. We can't do it tonight." Jason looked into each of their faces and realized that, well, he was on his own. He never should have let Bruce talk him into going to see the train. His dad was going to kill him. He stood up and ran back to the depot to grab his bike and head home. He didn't know if he should ride fast and try to make things up with his dad or ride slow, knowing what he was facing when he arrived home. It wasn't like him to break his promises to his dad, and the guilt was overwhelming. His dad had always been there for him, and now Jason was letting him down. And as he pulled up into the driveway, he could see the truck sitting outside the garage under the light. When he got closer, he could see that it was piled high with cantaloupe. Jason knew what had happened and was sick to his stomach. Entering the door, he found his dad sitting in his recliner watching a little TV before bed. "I kept your supper warm, son. It's in the oven." Of course he had made supper as well. He didn't know that Jason was going to grab a burger with his friends. "Dad, His dad turned off the television, stood up, and came toward him. Dancer must have seen the guilt and shame in his son's eyes. The eye contact made Jason even more sick as he held back the tears, knowing how much he must have hurt his father. Dancer didn't ask for a reason. He didn't ask for an explanation. He simply put his arms around his son and said, "I love you, son. I forgive you. Now eat your dinner and get some rest. We have to leave early in the morning." He kissed the top of Jason's head and went quietly to his room. Jason knew he couldn't eat, so he put his supper in the fridge for later. Then he went to his room and thinking about his father's reaction, which seemed to him make him feel even more guilty. He almost wished his dad had punished him, made him pay for his error in judgment and his lack of responsibility. He switched off the light and lay back in bed and quietly wept, thinking about how much his dad must love him. You know, it isn't the act or the realization of our selfishness that causes us to melt at times like these. It's the reaction of the people that we have failed. It's the look in the eyes of the people that we have done a disservice to. It's not the pain of our own conscience that we struggle with so much, but the realization of the pain that we have inflicted on others by letting them down, by our own negligence. Now, we can deal with our own conscience. We can take steps to fix the flaws in our character. What we cannot do is fix the wounds that we have perpetrated on the people that we love and care for. The younger we are, the more difficult it is for us to understand just what all that means. It takes age, wisdom, and experience to understand the pain that we inflict on others. In some ways, it's kind of like a mirror. When we look in their eyes, we see the pain that others have caused us, which allows us to embrace empathy with regards to their hurt. You know, there are those among us who have, over the years, girded ourselves with armor and a lack of empathy due to the many times that others have hurt us. We can keep others at a distance and not allow them to get close in order to protect ourselves. And we can feel this is justified, a matter of survival in a world where people feel no obligation towards us and the promises that they have made to us. What we have to be sure of is that we don't become so calloused that such behavior no longer bothers us. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter, and then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Jesus doesn't call out to Peter. All he does is look at Peter, and Peter looks back into his eyes. They don't need to speak to each other. Jesus can see the guilt and the remorse, the anguish in Peter's eyes, And Peter can see the love, grace, and forgiveness in the eyes of Jesus. Nothing else needs to be said. And as Jesus takes up his cross, beaten and bloodied as he stumbles his way to Calvary, Peter is left to deal with pangs of regret that are burning a hole into his heart. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Never in the history of the world has there been a more poignant moment for us to reflect on our own failures as this one, where we can see our own sin compounded and heavy as Christ forgives us and pushes toward the cross to redeem us anyway. Forgiveness when no forgiveness is justified. Grace when there is no room for grace. Mercy from whom no mercy was shown. Jesus has experienced this kind of heaviness, this burden that is a reflection found in the eyes of others when they feel that they have been let down. You know, when Jesus delays his travel to Bethany, knowing how ill Lazarus was and how concerned Mary and Martha are, he knows he will find what he will find when he gets there. Now, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her were also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Come, Lord, come and see. And Jesus wept. Jesus wept. We find ourselves asking, why is Jesus weeping when he knows that he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead? Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, and Jesus is about to perform one of the most important miracles of his ministry. Why is he sad? Why does he weep? He weeps because he knows how much faith Mary and Martha had in him, and they believed that he has let them down. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. This moment between Jesus and Mary is not about the death of Lazarus. It's about the anguish that Mary feels knowing that Jesus could have saved her brother if he'd only come sooner. Jesus looks into her eyes. Although there's still a magnificent amount of love between them, he sees that Mary holds him responsible for the death of her brother. And he weeps, not at her anger or at her frustration, but at her pain, feeling that the only person she could count on had failed her. He weeps at her anguish. He knows that everything's going to be all right in a minute. But right here, right now, in this moment, staring into each other's eyes, there is a pain that so many of us have felt at some time or another. Jesus doesn't feel guilt because he knows all of this has happened is part of a larger purpose, but his empathy for Mary and her anguish is paramount at this moment. So it is. When Jesus looks at Peter and Peter looks back at Jesus, Jesus sees the guilt, pain, frustration, and remorse in Peter's eyes, knowing that he has let Jesus down, even after Jesus has told him that it would happen. And Peter sees not anger or condemnation as expected, but instead he sees love, grace, compassion, forgiveness. And all of this sends daggers of fire through his heart as he leaves Jesus to his fate and goes off to deal with his own pain and weeps bitterly. You know, we see that same kind of engagement with Jason and his father in our story today. Jason knows that he's let his father down. His guilt is overwhelming, yet he looks into his father's eyes and he sees love, grace, compassion, forgiveness. Not at all what he was expecting. How often are we given to anger when people let us down, and we feel justified by our response? But I tell you, that's not the response of Jesus, and we are ultimately called to be like him, even when those that love us the most hurt us so badly. It always hurts more when that pain is caused by someone that we love. That is because we've allowed them to bypass our defenses, allowed them to be close to us, and we are left vulnerable to their neglect and irresponsibility. But here's something to note. Write it down. Burn it into your hearts and minds. Carve it into stone. Jesus never, ever, ever lets us down, even when we think he does. He sees our misplaced anguish just as he saw Mary's misplaced anguish. He came to change the world by teaching us that we should live our lives by the way he lived his. And when we, with our calloused and wounded faith and our heart devoid of hope, look into his eyes expecting him to apologize to us or punish us for our transgressions, what we actually find is love, grace, compassion, mercy, forgiveness. Jesus weeps with us. He understands that we don't understand the things of heaven, the nature of God, and have barely touched on the wonders of creation. And in his glory, he came to die on the cross and weep for each of us and with each of us, even as we stare back in confusion, despair, guilt, and blame. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. Father, they don't understand. Please don't hold their ignorance against them. I die willingly so that they might live. Here we are stepping into Holy Week again. Today is Palm Sunday when we celebrate Jesus' triumphant arrival into Jerusalem, a time when so many proclaimed him to be king, not understanding the kind of king that he would be. And because they did not understand, by the end of the week, when they bowed to false accusations and witnesses, seeing that he was not the king that they were expecting, they would turn on him and demand his death. The Lord turned, looked straight at Peter, and then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. I challenge us all to stare into the eyes of Jesus this week and see the way that he is responding to our treachery, our disobedience, our character flaws, our moral failures. If you return his gaze, you will not find condemnation, anger, prejudice, or retribution. You will only see love, grace, mercy, and compassion, and forgiveness. God bless you all. Amen.